Welcome, everyone, to the Real Canadian Liberal podcast. Once again, I'm your host, Stu Stoudinger. And just before we kick off, you can find this podcast on YouTube at Real Canadian Liberal and on Twitter at Real Canuck Lib. Also, realcanadianliberal.locals.com. Also be up on Rumble as well, and we're also on Facebook at Real Canadian Liberal. So there you go. That's where you can find us. So today, what are we going to talk about? Okay, I've got a little bit of a presentation for you. I'll just click across here so you can see here, and run you through this presentation. I want to talk to you about issues that we've got in Alberta, and introduce you to a character. His name's James Coates. He was arrested in March 2021 for refusing, well, for quite some time, to follow the guidelines, orders, whatever you want to call them, from the Alberta government. He's a pastor in a church in Edmonton, Alberta, or near Edmonton. And ever since the restrictions started coming back in last October, the church just ignored them. They just carried on doing their normal thing, operating at full capacity, not enforcing a mask mandate, etc., etc. And eventually he got arrested. And anyway, he was arrested, he was charged, he went to prison. They said that he could get out on bail, but he refused to sign the bail conditions, because the conditions were that he would stop doing what he was doing, and he refused to sign it. So he spent some time in and eventually came out. But anyway, just before he got arrested, and I guess he kind of knew it was coming, he gave a sermon, and he's preached from Romans 13, went through, some Christian philosophy on the roles and authorities of government versus roles and authority of the church and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, went through all that kind of stuff, and then on the Tuesday he went in and surrendered himself, because the police had told him to, or requested that he surrender himself. So he did, and the whole saga kicked off. Anyway, his sermon went viral, lots of people talking about it, all that kind of stuff. And Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney, he commented about the Coates' sermon. Long story short, I think the summary of Premier Kenney's view was a libertarian sermon in the middle of a pandemic is not that appropriate, something along those lines. So anyway, that was what came out of the Premier's office. But what they both missed, not necessarily that they've missed it entirely, but it didn't come out in public that they had paid attention to this, is that there are some major legal and ethical problems with SARS-CoV-2 policy, both from the Alberta government and the federal government and every other government in Canada. And I guess that wasn't James Coates' point. He wasn't pointing out the legalities of it. He was pointing out what he believed from a Christian viewpoint. But I don't think he needed to even go that far. He could have stopped purely at the legalities of it. Anyway, that's up to him. He's a pastor. That's his job. He takes it from that viewpoint. Whereas I, on the other hand, take it from a slightly different viewpoint. Not that I disagree with everything that he said, but his sermon wouldn't go down that well necessarily with a secular audience. But the whole point is there's plenty of justification for his actions without ever opening any of his sermon. But anyway, we'll get on to that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to something that covers the conduct of police, military, that kind of stuff in Canada, the RCMP anyway. Certainly covers uniformed services under Her Majesty the Queen, which includes the Canadian Armed Forces. And I'm quoting from the Canadian version of Queen's Regulations and Orders here, is because even though I was a British military officer, and this is pertinent for the people who serve here. And it says, an officer or non-commissioned member is not justified in obeying a command or order that is manifestly unlawful. In other words, if a subordinate commits a crime in complying with a command that is manifestly unlawful, he is liable to be punished for the crime by a civil or a military court. So there you go. RCMP are covered by that, as are the Canadian Armed Forces, etc. And there's a version of it in the Royal Air Force Queen's Regulations and Queen's Regulations for the British Army, etc. I'm sure it's all over the Commonwealth. So we'll move on from that. On top of that, Nuremberg Principle 4, Nuremberg Principles, which are still considered valid when in the International Criminal Court, which now goes under uses the Rome Statute for convictions under the criminal court. Used to be originally the Nuremberg Charter, and then got replaced by various other interim charters and interim tribunals until the Rome Statute was formalized and the International Criminal Court formalized about 20 years ago. Anyway, this principle still stands. The fact that a person acted pursuant to order of his government or of a superior does not relieve him from responsibility under international law, provided a moral choice was in fact possible to him. Oh, so there you go. It's not just military personnel. It's anyone who falls under Nuremberg Principle 4, which in Canada is everyone, because the Canadians helped write the Nuremberg Principles and the Nuremberg Charter and helped draft the Rome Statute and are signatories of all of them. So, hey presto Canada, civilians, military, you all have the same legal responsibility when it comes to illegal orders or commands. So, let's figure out what constitutes an illegal command or order. In the military, effectively, something that is unethical or illegal would constitute a manifestly unlawful command or order. So let's have a look and see what Canada's governing authority looks like. And this is the thing that James Coates and the Premier of Alberta both seem to have missed. I don't know whether they actually missed it, but didn't come across that they got it. This is how most constitutional democracies are set up, roughly speaking. Now, there's some nuance in here. This is a very simplified version of it. But the long and the short of it is this. We have, in Canada, the Constitution and Charter law. That's effectively the rule book for government. It is, what is the government allowed to do? What are their primary roles and duties? The Americans have a similar thing with their Constitution, although it's obviously not a royal charter, whereas ours is a royal charter. But it's the constitutional charter law. It's the rule book for government. It is how all the rest of government is supposed to operate, or what their limits are. It's the box that they're supposed to stay in. It's the lane that they're supposed to stay in. And then underneath that, you have the government. You have the crown, the executive. So that's the monarch, the governor general. Right? And then in the green here, you've got the legislative branch of government. So you got Parliament and the Senate. And then you got the justice system. So the justice system and the courts. And there's a little bit of nuance here. There's a blurring of the lines here because the Prime Minister is in the executive. He's also in the cabinet. The Attorney General, who is also the Justice Minister, is a member of the cabinet. So there's some crossover between the legislative and the judicial system, and the legislative and the executive. And it comes to the point at the cabinet is where lines get blurred. This is not a perfect system. The reason it's not a perfect system is because it's an evolved system. It started off way back 800 years ago, coming towards this system, and we're still, as you can tell, evolving it. Hence, it's not ideally done. But the idea is that these three branches of government are supposed to balance each other out. And none of them are supposed to break the Constitution or Charter law. They're supposed to operate within it. And there is a process by which they can add to the Charter, or they can modify things slightly. But the point is, that's their rule book. That's the law. Okay? And that's the highest law in the country. Anyway, Parliament is the legislative body. They can create other laws, statute laws, basically laws on how these charter laws are going to be enforced. So, for instance, right, property rights. In the Canadian Constitution, it's a provincial mandate. So, however, in order to protect property rights, you have in the criminal code laws on theft, right? What constitutes theft, what constitutes fraud, etc. Right? That is the law, how the statute law protects the guarantees of the Charter. It's kind of a simplified way of putting it. And the monarch has to approve the law. Okay, the Governor General signs off on it on behalf of the monarch, and the law is applied and enforced by the judicial system. So those who break the law, i.e. this statute law or this charter law, but predominantly the charter law, the statute laws that protect the charter laws, the justice system deals with. So there's the basic system. And then underneath all this, the civil service, who grease the wheels and keep the whole system of government working. Right? But the long and the short of it is, everyone has to follow charter law. Because prior to the first charter, we had this thing called the divine right of kings. The king could do whatever he wanted. The king could go out and kill somebody. Right? That's all right. It was the divine right of kings. He could do whatever he wanted. And everyone said, that's a really bad idea. And they were right 800 years ago, and they're still right today. It's a really bad idea for anyone to have all of that power. So what they did is they created this thing called a charter. So you have a rule of law. Everyone, the Queen, the Prime Minister, the Attorney General, the Cabinet, everyone, all the way down to the guy or girl on the street, falls under this charter law. None of them are allowed to operate outside the box. You're not allowed to go and kill your neighbor. It's simple. They have a right to life. Right? So that's the law. That is the supreme authority of government in Canada. That charter, the Constitution and Charter. It's not the Prime Minister. It's not the Queen. It's not the Attorney General. The supreme authority of government in Canada is the Constitution and the Charter. So how does it look at the provincial level? Very similar. We don't have a Senate at the provincial level. Same idea though, right? Got the Lieutenant General instead of the Governor General. Got the Premier instead of the Prime Minister. Got Solicitor General instead of the Attorney General. Other than that, it's the same thing. It's just another step of government, another level of government, but same thing. They're still bound by Constitution and Charter law. So, what does that mean? Well, it means that we have Constitution and Charter law covered by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and other rights that are not covered in the Charter of Rights and Freedom. Under Section 76, its rights codified in previous charters. I mean, we can go back to the Great Charter of 1215, the Petition of Right 1628, Habeas Corpus Act of 1679. We still follow that, habeas corpus, due process, all that kind of stuff. The Bill of Rights of 1689, Canadian Bill of Rights of 1960, common law precedent, all that sort of stuff. That forms a body of additional protection of rights and freedoms over and above that codified directly in the Charter. But it's not just previous charters within our Commonwealth tradition, but it's also all the international charters and conventions that we've signed up to. Right? So there was the Nuremberg Charter, which has now been replaced by Rome Statute, but there's also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, which is modeled after, our charter system, or the original English charter system, the Bill of Rights of 1689, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights from 1976, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, 1976, the Convention on Protecting Women, the Convention on Checking the Rights of Children, etc., etc. And Canada signed up to all those. So those are actually part of our charter law. We're not allowed to break those. So we can't break our own national law. We can't break the international law that we've signed up to. Right? And the government can't either. The Queen can't. The Premier can't. The Prime Minister can't. Those are the laws that govern their limits, where they can go in conducting their duties as members of one of the branches of government. So that's how it works. So, those rights, those freedoms that are guaranteed under those charters may not be violated, except in Section 1 of the Canadian Charter. Most people consider this to be reasonable. Some people don't. But anyway, the point is, most people consider this to be reasonable, that you have a section that highlights reasonable limits on rights and freedoms, i.e., there comes a time, perhaps in extenuating circumstances, where you need to limit a freedom or a right of an individual or of the whole country to meet some important challenge of some sort. So we have that in the Section 1. Okay? So we have rights subject only to reasonable limits as prescribed by law and demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. the terms out of Section 1 of the Charter. So, what does that mean? Prescribed by law. It says the actions not authorized by statute are not prescribed by law. That means some cabinet minister or some government bureaucrat cannot put out an order and say, you must follow this, because that's not been prescribed by law. It's prescribed by law when what they demand as a limit is legislated on by the legislature, voted on, and therefore now becomes the law. It becomes the limit, if it's demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So it's now prescribed by law, but it still has to be demonstrably justified. Okay, and it must not be vague. It must be precise and ascertainable. Right? So when you have a bureaucrat saying 1 minute, oh, that wearing of masks doesn't do anything against viral disease, and then later on turn around and say it does, the science hasn't changed. What's changed? Well, we'll get to the science on that, but the reality is it must be precise and ascertainable, right? So if you keep changing the goalposts, that's not precise, it's not ascertainable. Therefore, it is in violation of Section 1 of the Charter, and it has no legal standing. It's that simple. So it hasn't been voted on by the legislature in a reasonable time period, and it's not precise and ascertainable. The goalposts keep changing. Therefore, it is not prescribed by law. Therefore, it is not legal under Section 1 of the Charter. Now, what else is there? Oh, it must be reasonable and demonstrably justified. What does that mean? Well, Section 1 of the Charter says the onus is on the onus of government to prove that any limit on rights and freedoms are both reasonable and justified. And the way we do that in Canada, the Supreme Court set the precedent way back in the 1980s, is to put through the Oakes test. So it not only has to be prescribed by law, but it also has to be demonstrably justified and ruled on, by the courts, by the Supreme Court, which is in the last year never happened. Okay, so not only is it, so we'll go through that. The Oakes test. What is the Oakes test then? How does it work? Well, a couple branches. The first branch is that you must have a pressing and substantial goal. There has to be a large societal need, right? You can't just do this stuff arbitrarily. You have to have, if you're going to limit someone's rights and freedoms, there has to be a bloody good reason for it. So let's have a look at this bloody good reason. Okay? What that means is it must be sufficiently important to justify limiting a charter right. So let's have a look at Alberta. Here we are in Alberta. This is the all-cause mortality, deaths per million per day for Alberta, Canada from 2001 to 2021. And as you can see there, 2020 peaked out at 18.4 deaths per million per day. Okay, so that was the peak all-cause mortality in Alberta in 2020, according to Stats Canada. This is the latest Stats Canada data, as late as can possibly be gotten. Okay, which is right there. That orange line's pointing at the peak for 2020. Happened in January 2020. Incidentally, about 2 months before anyone brought any non-pharmaceutical lockdown measures. But anyway, that's the peak. But if you look at 2018, it peaked at 19.5. And if you look at that black line through the middle, that's the baseline death rate. Okay, so the excess death is the difference between that black line and the orange line, or the black line and the red line. And so you have a delta between 2018's peak and 2020's peak. And that delta means that we had a 32% higher excess mortality rate in 2018 than we did in 2020. And if you look back, 2017 peaked out higher. December 14 peaked out around about the same as 2020. Right? January 2013 peaked out at exactly the same peak as January 2020. And January 2005 peaked out at almost the same as 2020. So 2020, in terms of peak deaths per million per day in Alberta, is a 6 times in 20 years event. So it is a bad year, right? It's the third worst year in the last 5, right? Hardly sounds like Spanish influenza, does it? Let's have a look at Spanish influenza in comparison. So in order to look at 2020 in Alberta compared to 1918 in Alberta, the Spanish influenza, I've had to shrink the graph a little bit because otherwise this wouldn't fit on the page. And what I did is I took the profile that you can see here for 2020 and I stretched it to match the excess mortality and deaths per million per day compared to 2020. And what we found was that, right? So that is Spanish influenza, right, compared to COVID-19. Just in raw figures, that's just death per million per day. Spanish influenza produced 10 times the deaths per million per day excess mortality over and above the baseline than COVID-19. 10 times, right? It's pretty bad. But we can even look at that as slightly different. On top of that, we can look at it in a little bit more detail because that doesn't even tell the whole story. If we look at life years lost, and that is the number of quality adjusted life years that are lost for every death due to a particular disease or a particular cause, right? And compare Spanish influenza and COVID-19, I have to shrink the graph even further, down to there, right? And then I can put on Spanish flu. And I can compare them. Because in terms of life years lost, Spanish influenza in Canada, or certainly in Alberta, caused a life years lost death rate 420 times worse than COVID-19. It's 420 times worse. And do you want to know why? Well, it's pretty simple. COVID-19, the average death in Alberta was of someone who had less than 12 months life expectancy at the time of death, had they not got COVID-19. Okay? The average life expectancy of someone entering a nursing home in Canada is just under 12 months. It's 11 months and some days. Okay? So the average loss in terms of life years lost from COVID-19 was less than a year for each victim. Now those are tragic, as people died earlier than they would have had COVID-19 not come along, right? So it's still a tragedy for a family. You lose someone 4 months earlier, it's still a tragedy, it's still heartfelt, it's still hard on a family. But that's what we're losing in terms of life years. Now if we look at Spanish influenza, the average life expectancy loss per victim from Spanish influenza was 30 years. Not 11 months and some days, not 10 months, whatever it was for COVID-19. It is 30 years because the average life expectancy in 1918 in Canada was 58 and the average death was someone aged 28. So it wasn't an 84-year-old dying 4 months or 6 months or 12 months early. This was someone in the prime of life, a young father, a young mother, a cousin, an uncle, whatever, at age 28, dying 30 years before the average life expectancy. So that means in terms of life years lost, we're talking about 420 times worse Spanish influenza. So, COVID-19. How does that look in terms of a pressing and substantial goal set against the Oakes test for a reasonable violation ruling from the Supreme Court? Not particularly good, does it? So, let's press on to branch 2 to see how we go on in terms of proportionality between the goal and the means applied. Because we have this thing where we have to have a rational connection, i.e. the limit must be rationally connected to the objective. So, what actions you're taking, what limit you're placing on someone's rights and freedoms must be rationally connected to the objective. So let's investigate that, shall we? Let's have a look at asymptomatic quarantine. Well, asymptomatic transmission isn't the thing. Okay? It is either exceeding the rare or it doesn't exist at all. There was one study that came out of China, Wuhan, China, and it had an N of nearly 10 million, so that is a very broad study indeed, and they found not one case of asymptomatic transmission. And I'll hear people going, oh, yeah, but what about pre-symptomatic transmission? It's hard to get those apart. Well, okay, so let's have a look at pre-symptomatic transmission because, yes, there is some pre-symptomatic transmission. Let's have a look at it. The scientific data on pre-symptomatic transmission indicates that for every 135 pre-symptomatic cases, you'll get one infection. I'll let that sink in for a second. So for 135 pre-symptomatic people, you get one infection. And that is in a household, right? So it's a household setting where people are exposed to each other for much longer periods of time, and they're touching the same surfaces in the kitchen and all that kind of stuff. It's a much higher exposure than public exposure. We're talking about in the household. You need 135 pre-symptomatic cases to result in one transmission. Okay? And the average person that gets COVID-19 is pre-symptomatic for about 5 days. So you get one infection out of 135. That gives you an R of 0.0015. Right? And everyone goes, oh, we need to get the R0 below the R number needs to be below 1. Well, that's a long ways below 1. Right? That is not a rapidly expanding pandemic, epidemic of any sort. Right? So, asymptomatic transmission, not a thing. Pre-symptomatic transmission, pretty much not a thing. Okay, it's a thing, but it's very, very, very small indeed. So, asymptomatic quarantine, is that rationally connected to the objective? It has almost no effect. So therefore it is not rationally connected to the objective. So we can scratch that one. Let's have a look at the next test of proportionality. Minimal impairment. The limit on a right or freedom must be no more than absolutely necessary to achieve an objective in a real substantial matter. Minimal impairment. Oh, first off, we just talked about asymptomatic transmission. Is that a minimal impairment? We lock someone down for 14 days to stop a transmission that is highly unlikely to happen. In fact, probably isn't going to happen. Probably isn't even a thing. Yeah, minimal impairment. Doesn't really come into it. We lock down an entire society for what? It's hardly minimum. Final balancing. Let's have a look at this. There must be a proportionality between the deleterious and salutary effects of the law. That means the good effects, the beneficial effects, must outweigh the bad effects. And let's put it this way. In the military, we talked about the just war principle. Same idea here. The consequences of limiting rights and freedoms must not exceed the consequences of doing nothing. Same as when we were deciding, when a government decides when to go to war. The consequences of acting, conducting military action, must not exceed the consequences of not acting. That's a basic principle. It stops you from doing stupid stuff as a nation. Well, this is the same thing. This is supposed to stop government from doing stupid stuff, causing more damage than they stop. So let's have a look at that in a little bit more detail. Let's have a look at the effects of lockdowns. UNICEF estimated that 1 million African children starved to death between March and December 2020 as a direct consequence of lockdown effects. That's the downstream effects of shutting down the world's economy. We starved 1 million African children to death. That's not all. UNHCR estimated that 135 million additional people were plunged into food insecurity between March and October 2020 as a direct consequence of lockdown effects. So we starved 1 million African children to death. That doesn't count all the other ones. And that's children, people under the age of 12. So it doesn't count anyone over that age who starved to death. It's just the kids. And we threw 135 million people into starvation. In how long? A few months. That's it. The World Food Programme estimates that the ultimate starvation loss of COVID-19 lockdowns may reach 36 million deaths. What's the death toll of COVID-19 likely to run out to? It's number 20 on the list, I think, in terms of preventable death cause around the world. Heart disease and cancer are way beyond it. So there we go. It's not even on the list. And yet here we are looking at starving 36 million people to death to save what? A few lives? A few 100,000 maybe? Well, we haven't actually managed to do any of that. But the point is, that's the loss. That's the deleterious effect of lockdowns, of shutting down economies, closing businesses. That's just the starvation loss worldwide. One simple result of lockdowns. Okay, let's have a look at more. Suicides and overdoses have skyrocketed in Western society. In the US in the last year, 25% of Americans under the age of 20 have contemplated suicide. There's a lot who haven't just contemplated, they've gone and done it. Thousands of small businesses have been permanently closed while large corporations have made record profits. How is that good for society? That's a pretty negative effect, because small businesses, particularly in Alberta, provide most of the employment. And here's one for all the lefties who might be going, oh yeah, but we need to do X, Y, and Z, and the government needs to do X. Well, here's the thing. Industrial concentration is the single primary driver of wealth inequality in the world. It doesn't matter what government system you have. You can have a totalitarian regime, you can have communism, you can have fascism, you can have capitalism, you can have corporatism, all these different isms, right? Industrial concentration is the single biggest indicator of whether you're going to have massive wealth inequality or not. And what have we done? We've maximized industrial concentration by closing down lots and lots of businesses and leaving just a few corporations running the whole market. And that reduced competition leads to lower wages, higher living costs, and higher crime rates. That's well established. We've known that for decades, hundreds of years. Right? Adam Smith was railing about this in the 1770s when he wrote his book. Right? This is nothing new. Right? And increased poverty rates result in reduced life expectancies. That's well established. Bloomberg published several articles on it in the last year. Right? Wall Street Journal as well, I think. Life years lost due to economic impact is estimated to be about 6 times higher than the COVID-19 death toll. Now, this is long term, right? Politicians worrying about blood now versus blood in the future and all that kind of stuff. It's hard to trace back. Okay, I can't believe, right? It doesn't matter. People still die, right? And everyone's ignoring that. So, final balancing. There's a whole bunch more. I could add dozens more. Mental health issues, right? Effects on children's education. Little kids seeing their parents in a mask and not being able to read facial expressions. You know, kids before they're talking, they rely on nonverbal communication. What do? We've cut them off. That causes psychological damage. That's what you're doing to these kids, right? That's a negative effect that will affect them for the rest of their lives. That will affect their interactions with the rest of society for the rest of their lives. Do we really need a bunch more antisocial people around? Really? Is that going to help society? I think not. So, anyway, we can scratch that. So there we go. So the Oakes test, the measures taken by provincial, territorial, and federal government in Canada have failed. So it's not really surprising that none of them have taken this to the Supreme Court as they're supposed to under Section 1 of the Constitution, right? And put it through the Oakes test, which they're supposed to do to make it legal. So, seeing as none of this stuff is constitutionally legal, because it's never passed an Oakes test, it's never been justified in the Supreme Court. We're now talking about criminal activity. Well, what kind of criminal activity? Well, it's pretty simple. Asymptomatic quarantine is forcible confinement. It's a violation of Section 279(1) of the Canadian Criminal Code. It's also a violation of Section 6 of the Charter. It's a violation of part of the Rome Statute and a couple others as well, but that'll do. Right? And a Portuguese court ruled last year in Portugal. Same thing. Asymptomatic quarantine is a human rights violation. That's a Portuguese court last year. We know it. Enforcement by armed police without reasonable limitation ruling from the Supreme Court. Right? So if these haven't been turned into laws, they've never been voted on by the democratically elected legislature, and they've never been run through the Oakes test by the Supreme Court, it means they are not legal. They have not been given a reasonable limitation ruling from the Supreme Court. Therefore, they're illegal. So if they're being enforced by armed police, that is now a violation of Section 85(1) of the Canadian Criminal Code, which is the use of a firearm in the commission of a crime. Because their enforcement is criminal, and therefore if you're carrying a firearm, you don't have to use it, you don't have to point it at anybody, it just has to be present, it has to be in your possession. If you have a firearm in your possession when you're committing a crime, you're now guilty of Section 85(1) of the Canadian Criminal Code. Reporting of PCR cases, right? PCR cases, we've known for years. The guy who invented the PCR test knew that it was not diagnostic. It's not using PCR for DNA analysis in a court in Canada is not even admissible if the cycle threshold's over 25. And yet here we've had cycle thresholds running as high as 45. And reporting on all these cases, well, above 35, there's no live virus. No scientist on Earth has come up with a live virus above that. Now, I'll cover this in more detail when I go through the science, but here's the point. Reporting PCR cases, mandating of masks, masking children, none of which works. There's no science to back it up. Repetition of the false claim that SARS-CoV-2 is worse than seasonal influenzas. It's not. Professor John Ioannidis, the most highly ranked life scientist on Earth as of last year, he has a H-index score of 196, just published a paper the other day confirming that the worldwide IFR of SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, is 0.15. I calculated using the WHO's own data last July that was 0.14, so it wasn't too far off. 0.15. What is seasonal influenza? Seasonal influenza varies between 0.05 and 0.15, which means we're on the high end of seasonal influenza, which John Ioannidis said, oh yeah, in March last year, or April last year, and he got absolutely lambasted by the press for it. And then the World Health Organization published the paper that he wrote on their own website last September. So, all of this stuff is false, right? Saying that it's worse than seasonal influenza is false. And when you do something like that, and you scare people by bringing out all this false, whatever, propaganda, that falls under Section 83.01 of the Canadian Criminal Code, which tells us what terrorism is. It defines terrorism. And it's also a violation of the Rome Statute, crimes against humanity, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, blah, 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 a whole bunch of other stuff. But anyway, there you go. So some few criminal acts there. There's another one. Cloth masks. They're being used everywhere. Millions of people walking around out there with cloth masks on. There's not much science on masks. Even you think there'd be hundreds and hundreds of scientific papers on the efficacy of masks against viral infections, respiratory viral infections. There aren't. There are 15. And there'll be 2 more published this year. One trial's going on right now in Guinea-Bissau and another one in India. Right? Worldwide, up to date, there have been 15 randomized controlled trials and cluster randomized controlled trials. Observational studies are not science. That's Aristotelian science. That's how we got flat Earth and the geocentric cosmological model. That's not science. It's just hypothesis creating. Real science is when you got a trial. And the real trials are simple. There was one started in 2009. It published in 2015. It was specifically on the use of cloth masks against respiratory viruses. And it very clearly showed a 300% increase in infection rates from the use of cloth masks, over and above people who use no mask at all. Right? And if you don't tell the public that, and they go out and they have increased infection rates, which lots of the stats across many of the US states and many places in Europe show, that's criminal negligence, which is Section 279 brackets 1 of the Canadian Criminal Code. It's also a Section 7 violation of the Canadian Charter. It's a violation of the Rome Statute and the Universal Declaration, etc., etc. It's illegal. It's against the law. And here's an important point. Let's have a look at this, shall we? The fact that a person acted pursuant to order of his government or of a superior does not relieve him from responsibility under international law, provided a moral choice was in fact possible to him. Nuremberg Principle 4. Adolf Eichmann at his trial in 1961. His defense was, I was just following orders. When he was convicted and hung, there was an article on it published, I think it was in the New York Post or Washington Post, I don't know, one of them, saying, we have now set a precedent creating the concept of a desk murderer. Right? He was just following orders. He was just administrating. He wasn't killing someone. He was just administering the arrest and shipping of Jews to death camps. He didn't kill them. He just had them shipped off. He just did the paperwork. Just following orders. Well, guess what? It didn't fly then. It didn't fly in the Nuremberg trials, and it doesn't fly now. It's not an excuse. Ignorance of a fact is an excuse in a court of law, but an ignorance of the law is not. And it doesn't matter if you're following orders. It simply doesn't. So let's have a look at Pastor James Coates then. There he is with his family. Right? Seems like a nice guy. He refused to enforce illegal health orders. We've already highlighted that these health orders are illegal. They've never been put through the due process of law required to make them legal, so they're illegal. And if the government was asking him to enforce them in his own church, they were asking him to commit a crime. He refused to aid and abet the criminal enforcement of illegal orders, and he was arrested, imprisoned, and charged for refusing to engage in criminal activity. Right? There you go. So that's James Coates. I'm going to introduce you to someone else now. Right? He was following the example of Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who also refused to do this sort of stuff in Nazi Germany. And the Gestapo killed him about 3 weeks before the end of World War II. So James Coates is walking in Pretty big footprints. I'm going to introduce you to a guy named Bruno Day. There's Bruno, hiding his face behind a folder there. 93 years old. In 2020, he was an SS guard at the Stutthof concentration camp. He was just following orders. He felt sorry for prisoners, but he was unable to help them, unable to free them. And in 2020, he was convicted of crimes against humanity by court in Germany. Yeah, just following orders. And here's the thing. This is the next thing you should really pay attention to. I want you to read these things properly. Right? Let's have a look at this. And this is from statements from the prosecutor. While there is no evidence of Day's direct involvement in a killing in Stutthof, prosecutors argued that as a camp guard from August 1944 to April 1945, he aided in all of the killings that took place during that period as a, quote, small wheel in the machinery of murder, close quote. So he didn't do it himself. He was just there. He was just facilitating it. And what else was said? The accused was no ardent worshipper of Nazi ideology, so he wasn't even a Nazi. Prosecutors argue in the indictment. Here's the however. But there is also no doubt that he never actively challenged the persecutions of the Nazi regime. So he was being charged with just going along with things. Interesting. He just didn't want to lose his job, didn't want to get in trouble, whatever. So he just went along. He didn't actually kill anybody. He just kept guard, made sure people didn't escape, whatever. Crimes against humanity. Bruno Day didn't actively challenge human rights abuses. He kept his head down rather than risk himself. That's what he did. He kept his head down. He went along to get along. He was one of the people enforcing the mask mandate at the front of Walmart. That's a Bruno Day type character. And he was convicted for crimes against humanity, and quite right too. At 93 years old. He went a long time thinking he'd escaped justice. Long time. The people who convicted him probably weren't even born when he was committing those things. The societies have a long memory. People have a long memory. You violate human rights. Better look in the mirror every morning. Think to yourself, are they coming today? Pastor James Coates, on the other hand, he actively challenged human rights abuses. He said, no, I'm not going to abuse people's rights just because someone else tells me to. It's illegal. No one's ever proven that this has never been demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. True, it never has. And he was willing to take the consequences on his own shoulders. Bruno Days are more common than James Coates's. And you might say, oh, it was a bit unfair on Mr. Bruno Day because he was only 17 when he was drafted into the SS. Well, let me tell you a story. This is something that's probably worth you listening to. When I grew up, I don't know what's happened with my screen here. It's causing me trouble. I'll close that down. Huh, there we go. Got rid of it. I don't know what's going on. Sorry about that. Anyway, my next door neighbor served in Bomber Command during World War II. One of his best friends, big strapping farm boy from southern Saskatchewan, was killed about 3 weeks before the end of World War II, flying a Lancaster bomber. Right? He was on his 50-something mission. Right? So he'd been there quite a while. He had just turned 17 years old. He flew his first mission over Germany to stop the Bruno Day types, the people who were just going along with it because they didn't want to get in trouble or just didn't want to raise a ruckus. Right? Well, this guy, he lied about his age. He was big enough to get away with it. He got into the Royal Canadian Air Force and he flew his first mission over Germany, flying a Lancaster bomber when he was 15 years old. And he'd been at war for 2 years when he was killed. So when you say, oh, it's unfair, you know, he's too young, blah, 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 blah. Well, there's a guy who at, what, 13, 14, understood the difference between right and wrong. He understood the difference between what is moral and legal and what isn't. And he gave his life at age 17 in defense of those principles. Right? He wasn't a Bruno Day. He decided not to be a Bruno Day. He decided to be a Pastor James Coates. So there you go. Bruno Days, unfortunately, are more common than James Coates's. So I'll remind you, the fact that you acted pursuant to order of your government does not give you an excuse when you break the law. Human rights law is at the top of the heap. Charter law is at the top of the heap. There is no divine right of kings. The executive, the legislature, and the judiciary do not have the authority to break that law, except under very, very carefully constructed and strict circumstances, none of which has happened. None of which. So, I'd just like you to leave that with you and have you think. Do I want to be a Bruno Day or do I want to be a James Coates? Because the more people who decide to be James Coateses, the less likely that this is going to get to the stage where a 13 or 14-year-old farm boy from southern Saskatchewan is going to have to volunteer to go risk his neck and die by the age of 17 to put things right. I'd like to leave that with you as a thought. Thank you very much. And I'll see you in the next video. Hopefully it won't be quite so dark.